That was a really great talk by Dr. Martel. Thank you so much, Sylvain. Our next speaker is a great pleasure for me to announce as well. When you go back and you look at the beginnings and the conceptualization of the field of nanomedicine, there are really 2 or 3 names that are the ones you find. After we got the initial guidance that there's plenty of room at the bottom, it took really 3 people to really lay out what that meant in terms of actual machines. Eric Drexler, Ralph Merkle, and we have Ralph with us here today. It's really an immense pleasure. Ralph works together with the third pioneer, Robert Freitas, and those 3 guys are the names that I think will be remembered for many, many, many decades to come as the people who basically have given us the theoretical superstructure upon which to hang all of our practical engineering developments in the field of nanomedicine. Today, Ralph is going to speak to us about medical nanobots and their development. By way of his recent biography, he, after graduating Stanford University in 1979, co-invented public key cryptography and is now a senior research fellow at the Institute for Molecular Manufacturing. He's also a director of Alcor, a professor at the Singularity University, and a co-founder of the Nano Factory Collaborative, which is working to take the superstructure, the theoretical structure that he, Rob Freitas, have laid out and actually start a fast start effort to create some working prototypes and working medical nanobots for everyone's benefit. So really just a great honor to have you here, Ralph. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you very much. What can I say? Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. So, have we got our slides at this point? And, oops, let me back up one. Yes, there we go. So, medical nanorobots and their development. So before I start, I'd like to say there are a few websites. I'll be able to provide just enough information, I hope, to tease you and make you say, oh, that sounds interesting. And then if you'll remember these websites, you can go and find further information. The first one is discusses nanofactories, what they are, how they might be developed. And the second one discusses nanomedicine, what it is, what the various possibilities are. And between them, they cover a fair amount of turf. And then, of course, you can always wander around with Google, which is a delightful way to spend actually a very long period of time. So what am I talking about? Essentially, I'm talking about things that we care about, health and wealth, and how those things that we care about relate to atoms. And in the upper left, you see a picture of coal, and in the upper middle, you see a diamond. Well, those are the same element, and it's carbon in both cases, but the arrangement has been changed, and we place a higher value on the diamond than we do on the coal. In the left, the lower left, you'll see a computer chip upon a pile of sand, and again, it's the same elements. If you take sand and add a pinch of impurities and rearrange the atoms, you get computer chips. So again, how the atoms are arranged is very important. And then, of course, for health purposes, the major question, the major issue of importance is how the atoms are arranged in you and me. Someone who is healthy in the bottom middle, someone who's unhealthy in the bottom middle in a hospital has atoms that are arranged in a way which is perhaps not optimal, whereas someone who's healthy on the right is out bicycling, having a good time. And again, the fundamental difference is how the atoms are arranged. Well, okay, that's very nice. Do we have tools for arranging atoms. And of course, we have the vast array of technologies that have been developed by chemistry, but what I'd like to focus on are some newer techniques that look like they have a great deal of promise and which looks like they can provide a more direct path to arranging and rearranging atoms. And in particular, we've seen experimentally the demonstration of atoms being arranged on surfaces. Here, we're looking at silicon atoms being arranged on a surface, and in fact, they're being arranged with such control that you can actually spell out specific letters, SI in this particular case, in the lower right-hand corner. Now, the reason I picked this particular one, by the way, every year when I give the talk, I take whatever the latest and most dramatic research is in terms of arranging atoms on surfaces. The reason I picked this one is that this is done at room temperature rather than in liquid helium or at some very low temperature. So we're now seeing a demonstration of arranging atoms at ordinary temperatures. We're seeing the making and breaking of bonds. In order to make those arrangements that you see, the experimentalist actually had to take a probe tip and touch it to the surface and make and break bonds in a relatively controlled way, and as a consequence, spell out the particular initials, SI, which you see in the bottom right, and which demonstrate very precise control. So we're now at the point where we actually can make and break bonds at room temperature. We're still confined to the surface. So if you look, you'll find excellent experimental demonstrations of arrangements of atoms on surfaces. You will not find people using this kind of technique to build three-dimensional structures. So we now have to move into 3 dimensions, and hopefully that will be coming in the next few years. So moving beyond the experimental demonstration, the next question is, well, how could we move into 3 dimensions? If we wanted to build complex structures that extended into 3 dimensions, how would we do it? Well, if you're using as inspiration the ability of a scanning probe microscope to probe and move individual atoms, then you might say, well, let's go ahead and use some sort of probe technique, some sort of positional technique, and let's use positional tools, very precise molecular tools, and have them interact with a structure so that you can build it. And the obvious question, if you propose that as an objective, is, well, what do the tools look like? So here we see a paper that was done a year or 2 ago now, which describes 9 theoretical tools. And what you're looking at, of course, is the very tip. So in other words, we'll have a larger structure that will hold the particular arrangement of atoms shown at the very tip. And the very tip can be analyzed theoretically. The tip can be modeled computationally using your favorite computational chemistry package. And you can see what the tools could do. And after looking at this particular set of tools and analyzing it, we see hydrogen, carbon, and germanium atoms involved here. We find that if you look at it and think about it and do enough work, and there's a nice detailed paper that discusses all of the reactions involved, you can use that set of tools to make another set of tools, which is a good basic property if you want to have molecular machines that can make more similar molecular machines. You can use those molecular tools to recharge that full set of molecular tools. And you can also use that set of molecular tools to make a wide range of nanorobotic devices. So that set of tools, which has been analyzed theoretically but not yet demonstrated experimentally, should allow us to build a wide range of interesting structures. Here's a particular structure. Again, this is a theoretical structure. This is a hydrocarbon bearing. It involves a shaft, which is diamond wrapped into a tube, and the shaft is inserted into a sleeve, and the sleeve is another flat sheet of diamond bent into a tube. It's kind of interesting. At the molecular scale, diamond is slippery, flexible stuff. So the idea of bending diamond is feasible if you've got a thin enough sheet of diamond. And these are very, very, very thin sheets, so we can bend them this way, and it looks like indeed the resulting structure should be stable. So this is a simple molecular bearing, conceptually very straightforward, and if we had an appropriate set of tools, we should be able to build it. Here we have something a bit more complex. This is a planetary gear. This starts to use other elements. It's using silicon and oxygen and hydrogen, but the basic idea is still there. It is a complex, three-dimensional structure, which presumably is inaccessible using today's chemical synthetic methods, but which we think we could build once we had an appropriate set of tools. Now, the particular set of tools I showed you, because they only deal with hydrogen, carbon, and germanium, would be insufficient to build this structure. This structure would require an additional set of tools and a fair amount of complex analysis, but we believe that the same conceptual framework would work like a charm. So, something like that. And then as you move on up the scale of complexity, there's no particular reason you couldn't build a robotic arm. Now, this robotic arm has not been designed in atomic detail, so you don't see the locations of every atom. The primary reason for that is that it has on the order of a few millions of atoms in it, and the design effort by itself would take significant work, and no one has walked up and said, here's a check for the sum of money that would be required to do a careful computational design and modeling of a robotic arm. Nonetheless, the basic principles are well understood, and we have a high degree of confidence that if someone said, yes, we want to have a detailed design, we could in fact make a design of a molecular robotic arm, and that particular robotic arm is perhaps 100 nanometers tall or so, so it's very small. We could go ahead and design such a thing, and then if we had an appropriate set of molecular tools, we could use those tools to build a structure like this. And in addition, a molecular robotic arm. Well, a molecular robotic arm would also be able to hold and position molecular tools, so the molecular robotic arm could be used to wield the self-same molecular tools from which it was built, so you could have a molecular robotic arm that built another molecular robotic arm. So you could now have basically a manufacturing system which could build more manufacturing systems, and that would offer a very low cost in terms of the overall manufacturing process, because having once gotten this process started, you could build more molecular manufacturing systems inexpensively. Okay, so that's the flavor of molecular nanotechnology, and now we move on to nanomedicine. And the basic observation is very simple, which is that disease and ill health are caused largely by damage at the molecular and cellular level. But today's surgical tools are big. They're large. So if you guide the finest surgeon's scalpel from the point of view of a cell, that's something that's more appropriate to rip and tear and destroy than it is to heal and cure. It's just not the right scale, not the right precision. So in the future, if we have molecular nanotechnology, we can build molecular medical nanodevices, nanorobots, that could then carry out specific medical tasks and could do so with molecular precision, and they could be guided by molecular computational devices. So we will have a whole new set of tools. And to give you a feeling for the size of these things, that robotic arm, that 100 nanometer robotic arm, that's represented by that red cylinder in the right. And it looks pretty small when you compare it with, for example, a mitochondrion, which is a subcellular organelle. And it also looks pretty small when you compare it with the CPU of an 8-bit computer, which would be designed using molecular mechanical devices. So it looks as though a robotic arm and a computer that would be able to control it would both be small on the scale of a mitochondrion, and even smaller when you start looking at what you might call a typical cell, if such a thing exists. So the mitochondrion is now much smaller than a cell, and the robotic arm vanishes into almost invisibility, you now start to see the size of other things, respirocytes and microbivores, which actually are a notable fraction of the size of a typical cell. So those devices are now devices on a scale which is smaller than a cell, but nonetheless visible on that scale. So what are these medical nanodevices I'm talking about? It's always useful to have a few examples. So the first example is a respirocyte. And what is a respirocyte, I hear you cry? It's an artificial red blood cell. Red blood cells pick up oxygen in the lungs, carry that oxygen to the tissues, release the oxygen, absorb carbon dioxide, carry that carbon dioxide to the lungs, release the carbon dioxide, and pick up more oxygen. To build an artificial red blood cell, you'd want to do that. And in particular, the artificial red blood cell design, the proposal is to use a miniature scuba tank. So if you have a sphere about 1 micron in size, it could hold compressed oxygen. And if you use diamond as your structural material, then you can hold highly compressed oxygen. So you might have oxygen at, say, 1,000 atmospheres, at which point you have a very high density of oxygen. And if you run through your numbers, you find that these miniature scuba tanks could hold over 100 times the oxygen of ordinary red blood cells, which means that if you have a therapeutic dose of these artificial red blood cells circulating in your body, they would be able to support your metabolism for some time. You could hold your breath for over an hour. Now, you might think holding your breath is no big deal, but suppose you are at risk for a heart attack. Normally, if you have a heart attack, you don't have much time. The heart attack can occur abruptly, and within seconds, a minute, you are no longer able to respond to do anything. If you had a therapeutic dose of these artificial red blood cells, if you had a heart attack, your heart would stop pumping, but the oxygen demands of your tissues would be met by the artificial red blood cells already in place, by the respirocytes that were there. They could release oxygen, and they could continue to release oxygen for up to an hour or so. And they could absorb carbon dioxide, which means that your first response on having a heart attack would be, oh my heart has stopped. And you'd call your doctor, or perhaps if you had built-in monitoring systems, your doctor would be automatically alerted that your heart had stopped, and you'd receive a cell phone call saying, your heart stopped, get on down to the emergency room, please. We need to take action. And now you've got an hour, or maybe a little bit more, in which to deal with the situation. So that's the first concept that was sort of described in terms of what would a medical nanodevice, what would a medical nanorobot do, or one of the first concepts. And how much time? 5 minutes, okay. So that was one of the first proposals, and the basic idea is simple. Compressed oxygen in a small 1 micron sphere circulating in the bloodstream with a mechanism on board to release that oxygen in a controlled fashion when oxygen partial pressures are low, and a mechanism for absorbing carbon dioxide when partial pressures of carbon dioxide are high, and doing the reverse in the lungs. So conceptually very simple and obviously very beneficial if we could build it. And the key issue is how do we go about building it, which I outlined briefly. Next idea, a microbivore. If we have artificial red blood cells, perhaps we could have artificial white blood cells. Could we have devices that would identify and digest pathogens in the bloodstream? And again, if you look at the possibilities here, you find that you can get a substantial performance improvement. Two major areas, an artificial white blood cell or a microbivore could more rapidly engulf and digest invaders, and also could do a more thorough job of digesting them in that time. So what they released into the body would be the constituents of the pathogen, the harmless constituents, amino acids, water, other things like that, that would not arouse the body into some sort of inflammatory or immune response. So that would allow you to more rapidly remove worse infections with fewer consequences to the body, and obviously, again, that would be advantageous. This system is becoming a bit more complex. Previously, we were talking about a tank of compressed gas. Now we have a device that at least has to sense the presence using some sort of binding sites that will bind to and identify foreign pathogens. It has to be able to do that, sweep them into the maw of the device and digest them, but still conceptually similar to something that exists in biology, operating somewhat faster and somewhat more effectively, and using some core similar concepts. Then we get to the next level of complexity, a chromalocyte. Now we're looking at a more complex device, one which doesn't seem to have a direct analogy in existing biological systems, but which would be very useful. We know that the nuclei and have DNA and various information in the nucleus which specifies which cell it is, whether it's a nerve cell or a liver cell or a tissue cell in the skin. If you could replace the nucleus, if you could go in and sweep out the old chromatin and put in the new, then you could replace the nucleus and you could eliminate genetic damage. You could repair and replace information that was incorrectly put there in the first place, so hereditary diseases would be amenable to cure. And in general, you could deal with a whole range of problems. This is a more complex system. This one is going to require navigation. If you want to replace the nucleus of a cell, well, you better replace the right nucleus of the right cell. If you replace the nucleus of a liver cell and have a prepackaged nucleus of a nerve cell, that's not a good thing. So you're going to have devices that not only can carry a replacement chromosomes, they will have to carry that replacement material, and they will have to navigate to a specific location in the body. So this assumes that we will have a system in place throughout the body that will provide highly accurate navigation, and that will let us identify all of the cells in the body. That's a lot of cells. So implicit in this device is a navigational system, a database, a detailed map of the body so that you know where to go, what nuclei to replace, and what to replace them with. All of that is conceptually feasible, but clearly it's more complex than, say, a respirocyte. And with that, I will say, how do we get there from here? And in order to get there from here, we have to develop medical nanodevices and nanofactories, and that will let us build devices that are able to manufacture these medical devices. And I think I'll skip that and simply end with this one. The purpose of societal investment in this kind of activity is basically to bring in the development time. It looks like development times on the order of 20 years are feasible if we have devices that are, if we have a plan, if we have an effort which is focused. It looks like the development times could easily take multiple decades, 30, 40 years, or even longer if we don't have some sort of focused program. That's it.
Thank you. We have time for about 4 minutes of questions for Dr. Merkle. Okay, Ralph, thank you very much.
Okay.